So, hi, I'm Sean Burgess. I am a horror and thriller author. I'm based out of Jacksonville, Florida. My debut novel is a paranormal thriller. It's called The Tear Collector, and it releases in December. So I'm really excited about this genre and being on the show.
Hi, I'm WREN HANDMAN. I'm a novelist and screenwriter. I do a lot of young adults, paranormal, science fiction, fantasy, and there's usually a little bit of paranormal stuff in most of the movies and TV shows I write.
Hi, I'm Cameron J. Quinn. I write supernatural suspense, and mine are a serial. I'm an award-winning author, and I'm super excited to be here. I haven't done anything in a while, so I'm ready to get things going again.
My name's Bruce Solheim, and I'm a mild-mannered history professor by day and a paranormal author by night, I guess. I've written a lot of history books and other things, plays. But my latest series has been a timeless series, which is nonfiction trilogy. The third book will come out next year, but my latest one is Timeless Deja Vu, and it documents all the paranormal experiences I've had. So this is all nonfiction. I'm kind of a paranormal lightning rod, if you will.
So I wanted to start by talking about the genre specifically and give you guys the definition that I found and have you react to the idea of this definition because it's interesting. But it says that most paranormal fiction genre are that of which is set in the real world that include experiences that defy scientific explanation. For example, stories set on Earth that include things like angels, demons, ghosts, psychics, vampires, etc.
I think that is right on the money for me. The big distinction between fantasy and paranormal is, are we rooted in a world that we recognize? Do we have New York and Paris and the sort of basic timeline of history that we're used to?
I think of like paranormal as definitely rooted in the real world, but something that it's possible might have a scientific explanation, although that might be, kind of beyond us.
I hope it's a good definition because I live a paranormal life, so I hope it's a real life. So I always think of the paranormal as normal, really. And I always use the example, with paranormal, like the feeling of being stared at. Because everybody has that feeling, but how does that work? You get the heebie-jeebies, you feel like somebody's staring at you, you turn around, sure enough, somebody's staring at you. And they've done these tests in the laboratory, and people really do have that ability to do that. And there is very little explanation of how that can be. So that's why I think it's more normal than a lot of people think, which makes it very interesting in a fiction setting.
The interesting thing I find about paranormal that is unique to this genre in specific is its ability to be anything other than paranormal. It could be like paranormal horror. You got romance. You have comedy. You have you have children's paranormal. You have young adult paranormal. You have paranormal seems to be the rooted aspect of a specific genre. I know some of you write in the horror aspect of it, and some of you write in the more, and Bruce, you write in the nonfiction aspect of it. So it has that ability to kind of transfer into other genres, not being a subgenre, but being part of the genre itself. which is unique to paranormal, I think, than any other genre.
You know, if you read Shakespeare's plays, you know, there's paranormal there. You know, I mean, it's in so many different ways in almost every film in one way or another, or every book, every story. There is some paranormal aspect to it, and you know, I think that it's like I just. I'm writing a paper for MUFON. MUFON's the Mutual UFO Network, and they've asked a couple of us to write some academic papers. And my paper or the topic they assigned me was, are UFOs paranormal? And my quick answer is, well, hell yes, they're paranormal. And I think that it is a phenomena that is, you know, the government's now releasing information, you know, like the gun sight videos that they've released by the U.S. Navy. And I think it's so versatile. It's a versatile umbrella that you can use for so many different things. And I would include UFOs and aliens and all that stuff under paranormal as well.
I think one of its benefits is also that it widens a narrow world. So, you know, we're starting to see all of these television shows that it's a detective show, but also there's magic, or it's a cop show, but also there's magic. I think it just lets you play with new ideas and new themes and kind of just add a little something to a story that might otherwise be too familiar.
The reason that I'm writing my serial the way that I'm writing it is because I can, you know, I kind of have in the first one this kind of mystery cop feel to it, but it becomes paranormal. And with each episode of the serial, I get to explore a different aspect of it. Some of them are more romantic, some of them are more horror, some of them are more of a thriller, and I'm having a lot of fun with that, and it keeps me from getting bored as a writer. And I'm hoping it will keep people from getting bored as a reader as well. So far, I've had good feedback, so, you know.
I think that's one of the great things about the genre is that it is so versatile. And then I think, like, secondarily, you can focus on some of your strengths. Like, I tend to write action and mystery and thriller type elements and horror elements really well. So you can seamlessly mix those into the story. And I think whatever the writer brings to it, their strengths can really make it really different within the genre.
So that being said, there are tropes to this genre that attach itself, especially when you're talking about incorporating ghosts and things to that nature. So are there specific tropes that you guys need to always incorporate into the writing process, even though you're writing for a specific, like, horror or, you know, romance or whatever you might be writing in? Do you feel like you have certain rules that you need to follow because of the genres or expectations?
You know, not that I write fiction, but you know, with vampires, you know, when you write any kind of vampire kind of stuff, I think you can't veer too far off, you know, from what people want in their vampire story. I don't know. I'm not a fiction writer, so
that brings up a good point, because with vampires for a long time they were the monster and that's all they were. And then it was flipped on its head when it became the vampire is now the hero of a romance. So
right.
One of the things that is important, especially with paranormal, because we had this big boom, you know, recently, is to make sure that you're innovating and not doing the same thing all the time, because readers do get bored and they want something new.
I think one of the big tropes that's really important to the genre is the idea of either the secrecy or the conspiracy. If we're set in the real world and people in the real world don't, generally speaking, believe in magic or believe in the paranormal, how does this thing exist without people finding out? I think that's a question that readers immediately are going to have as soon as you set them in this world, and that they're getting a little bit pickier about sort of being able to believe that no one knows that they're around. If vampires exist, why isn't one on film? Why isn't, you know, one in the National Museum?
There is some kind of truth telling to this genre, right? You have to be authentic. You really do, in order to kind of give a different experience, to give a more comprehensive experience. So how are you approaching your truth telling? Are you making sure that it's visual enough, or are you just letting everything come out and say, you know what, this is how it is, and I'm gonna give it to you and you're gonna deal with it?
I think it depends a lot for me on the project. With film, especially with something like a monster movie, for instance, if you don't have a, $20 million budget, CGI is going to look terrible. So what are you doing and what are you showing and how are you showing it becomes really important. And the truth for me is more in the characters and the situations they're in. And I think the magic can be quite subtle to me. It can be sort of, themes that you're seeing throughout, little, moments. It doesn't necessarily have to be a vampire movie or a werewolf movie in order to have that sort of interesting paranormal reality to it. But definitely you can't necessarily show things in the way you can in a novel because you're constrained by your budget.
Yeah, and I would introduce the idea that, one of my favorite directors is Werner Herzog, and I was really lucky to get a chance to interview him. He's done a lot of documentaries like Grizzly Man and about that guy who lived with the grizzlies in Alaska. And he has this concept he calls ecstatic truth, because some people have argued that he has played kind of fast and loose with the so-called truth in his documentaries, but he says it goes beyond something of, what he calls pedestrian truth, or, he's got a really good term for it. But anyway, he says he approaches something called ecstatic truth. And I think when you have personal paranormal experiences, you start dealing with that, things that are so unusual and sometimes seemingly, is this partly real, partly not real, that you get into that realm. And when you're sticking to your interpretation, but you're presenting it in a very interesting and unique way.
I'm curious for our fiction writers here. Is paranormal one of those genres that you have to experience to kind of understand, or do you think you can go from the peripheral and look inward toward, especially with the ghost aspect, I guess? But obviously, the vampires and werewolves and stuff like that, nobody's come across those, hopefully. But did you find that your research was a little bit deeper than you maybe thought it would be or turned out to be?
You haven't read my third book yet, Joe. You never know. You're a vampire. I'm just
Nice.
So I did some research for my book, but it was based on some aspects of science. I think one of the powerful parts of the paranormal genre is to either ground it in some type of commonly known myth or held belief, but yet you have the also unexplainable aspects of it. And I think it lends to some of its power by doing that. Also, I think one of the things that creates the magic around paranormal stories is how the characters in those stories, and that could be film or literature, how they're affected by the events that if you and I had to experience, there's no telling, how we would react.
I've also had quite a few experiences in my life with cryptids and spirits and entities. I won't get into it too much here, but a lot of my desire to explore the paranormal came from there, and I feel like doing it in fiction makes it safer. It makes me feel safer. I like to focus, though, on urban legends and where the legends came from, and I use those to kind of then create a new monster or something like that to go in my stories.
I had some really interesting research challenges when I was writing about werewolves. I wanted to look into where all the myths came from and how werewolves could exist in the real world, and all of these completely different legends could somehow all be true. But one of the interesting challenges I ran across is in stories, they're always activated by the full moon, and that's what turns them into a wolf. And it's always at night. But in reality, the moon sometimes rises at like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. In this young adult story about this werewolf kid who was supposed to be going camping every full moon to disguise it, and then I realized he'd be missing school because it was during the day.
Yeah, there are some silliness to these tropes too, right? I mean, that's the fun thing about it, and playing with them and toying with them a little bit. I would imagine you guys had some fun doing that.
I was just that song "Werewolves of London" just got popped into my head.
Yeah,
that one line is hilarious. He was sipping a pina colada at Trader Vic's, and his hair was perfect. That's a tremendous line.
are you guys married to a certain paranormal type? Do you guys, or do you want to explore them all? Are you interested in all of the aspects, ghosts, vampires, all that?
I like to bounce around a little bit and keep it fresh. My sequel obviously will be grounded somewhat in the same type of paranormal, but I'm working on a standalone urban fantasy right now that really tackles like completely different elements of the paranormal than what the first book does. So, I mean, for me as a writer, I just kind of get bored if I'm doing the same thing all the time. So I do like to switch it up.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I can't imagine, people who write 27 books in the same series. And I just think, don't you get tired of the same ideas every single time? I want to do something new. Duology is hard for me without getting bored. So I do, characters and werewolves, and I make up my own supernatural creatures. And yeah, it's just constantly about sort of exploring new things, trying new things. I think for me, the thing that drives me is that discovery and the like I said earlier, the widening of the world and like what you can see in the world when you play with all these different ideas and these different stories.
I'm in the same boat. I'm planning on doing different series. I have a rough outline for a witch series and a vampire series and a werewolf series, just kind of to explore and have fun with, because that's kind of what I'm all about, is just writing should be fun and I want to have fun with it.
I think you get to really love your characters sometimes, and it's hard to let go of them. I think that would be true. In my plays anyway, I was very sad when the performance ended, and I wasn't going to write a sequel to the play. I wanted to know what's going to happen.
Well, along those lines, is that why the paranormal genre speaks to you all? Is that because it's just fun to play in? It's the best way to play as a writer, as a creator. Is that true?
For me, I've never had any like personal experiences. I'd be the guy that wants to stay in the haunted house, but I've always been fascinated by movies and literature that's about the unknown, because it's just so many possibilities. So as a writer, I think it is a great place to play because you can take a story pretty much anywhere.
I agree 100%. I think that it allows you to dream in a way that you can't necessarily when you're constrained by the realities of the world that we live in. And, writers often talk about write what you know. And, that's kind of boring. I'm a, suburban white woman from Canada. There aren't that many stories that I feel like the world really needs to hear about me. But when I'm writing paranormal, when I'm writing fantasy, I can break out of those constraints and imagine anything that I want. And that I think is really powerful.
I think that's definitely one of the benefits of the genre. And one of the reasons that I enjoy it is just because you can like Bruce said, I do fall in love with my characters, which is why I have a serial. I love my character, Zurich in particular. So that's why I created this serial, because I can go back to him as much as I want, and I can just create more seasons if I'm not done. I'm all about multiple sandboxes, which is why I've played in the paranormal for so long, because it's a big sandbox, whereas my other sandbox is crime. And I have a lot of fun with it, but it does tend to get repetitive.
How did it all begin for you guys? Where was your introduction to paranormal? I think this is where you're going to chime in, Bruce, and tell us your beautiful story.
Yeah. All right. Okay. At age 4, I had my first paranormal experience. It was in northern Norway, on a remote island 200 miles above the Arctic Circle. We were staying at my grandmother's house. And this place is so remote, there's no hospitals anywhere around there. The only way on is by air or by boat. And I got very sick, very, very sick. My whole body got stiff. I couldn't move my head to either side. My neck was stiff. I had a high fever, was having difficulty breathing. And my grandmother put me in this little bed in her kitchen. And she had that little bed there because she had a bad leg and she couldn't go up and down the steep stairs very easily. So she spent so much time in the kitchen anyway. So anyway, I fell asleep. I was in that bed, and the relatives came over and started telling their stories about how Uncle Sven had got the same symptoms and died the next day, and all these Grim Reaper stories. And so I was crying myself to sleep. And when I woke up, nobody was in the kitchen, and I saw this bright light above me in the ceiling, in the beams of this old farm kitchen. And it was a bright, warm light. And it was so warm and it was so bright. And it wasn't any kind of light from a light bulb or anything. And I looked at it, and it just gave me this feeling that everything was going to be okay. And I went to sleep. And when I got up in the next morning, I was completely fine. I wasn't sick at all. And my mom and I told my mom and my grandmother that I had seen this light, and they said that was my guardian angel and that it was a miracle. So that kind of opened the door for me. I think for the rest of my life, I kept having paranormal experiences. They were random but frequent.
I think for me, it was like film and TV. I remember watching like episodes of The Twilight Zone and things like that, and really just being completely fascinated by the paranormal and the what if. And I think that got my mind going in a million different directions.
It was more about like just my imagination. Like we had lots of stories, and like my family has all had paranormal experiences, so it wasn't really out there. It was just like part of things. But when I saw shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Unsolved Mysteries and all those things, it made it a little bit more fun. It was less like everyday things and more like something that could be fun to experiment with. So my first story I started writing when I was 10 was a portal fantasy that I still, play with just because it's fun. And that's kind of where it started for me. When I was having I lived in an extremely haunted house, and that wasn't fun at all. So, that actually I stopped writing when I lived there, because I couldn't deal with it. It wasn't. I wrote romantic comedies when I lived there. When I'm not living it, I'm able to explore it in writing. Let's just put it that way.
I remember when I was about 3 or 4, I used to have these incredibly vivid dreams about flying. And I always needed to take like a really long run, and then I would sort of leap and I would fly into the air. And I was half convinced that I could actually fly. And I was smart enough not to like jump off a building or anything, but I decided to test this by jumping off my couch. So I took like a big running leap down the couch and I jumped off, and of course I fell. And I felt so betrayed by the universe. I was so convinced that because I'd had these vivid dreams, it must have been real. And I think a part of me had sort of been searching for that ever since, that idea that there's more to the world than we see and that we think of.
This particular genre has a lot of skeptics. It has a lot of people who want to debunk what you're trying to do and how you're trying to do it. So in that respect, how much of that do you think about? How much do you care about that?
To be honest with you, I don't really worry about that at all. What I want people to get out of my stories, I'm not trying to like prove anything exists or prove, that vampires have been around. What I want to do is really just entertain people. And so that's my goal first and foremost. I want to do that with an exciting story, good characters. I'm sure that there will be people that criticize it, saying that's not realistic. The one thing I try to do to counteract that is ground my story in as much reality as possible and make the characters as authentic as possible, so that hopefully when I throw some of the more fantastical elements at them, they've suspended their disbelief enough to accept that as part of the story.
Yeah, I'd say the same thing, that internal consistency is so much more important in this genre than it is in others, that because you're asking them to suspend their disbelief and to believe in these magical creative things, you really need to get all of your other details really, really right, because they are accepting all this other stuff, so you have to get the rest of it really, really accurate. So I actually spend a lot of time researching basic things like sizes of cities and where landmarks are and that kind of stuff, because I feel like you need to get that right, and then you can kind of play with everything else.
I really don't worry about it. Like they said, as long as you have your realistic characters and things like that, that's kind of what matters. If somebody's upset or feels like I'm being too like fantastic with my monsters, it's like, well, read a different book. It's fantasy. It's supposed to be like that, So yeah, I don't worry about it. I do worry about my characters, because I think having realistic characters and realistic emotions and dealing with human things is where people get connected to the story and how it can help them escape from what they're dealing with or help them deal with it or whatever. I think that's where people really get worth from stories, even when they're fantastical. So yeah, I don't worry about the naysayers.
Nice.
Yeah.
Bruce, they must come right in your face with
Well, I've had some, you know, and it's interesting because they attack me, you know, and personally, which is kind of interesting. I remember I did an interview with Jeffrey Mishlove, who's a parapsychologist, and he used to be on PBS. Anyway, he does this series, and he was interviewing me about my childhood paranormal experiences. And this one, I had very few criticisms, but this one I remembered, it was pretty funny. This guy said, I believe none of it. This guy's a big lump of nothing. I thought, wow,
Jeez.
a personal thing. And this other guy criticized my college for, you know, because I teach a paranormal course at Citrus College, in addition to my regular history courses. And he said, Citrus should be ashamed of themselves for allowing that course to be taught. You know, and I know personally they're not ashamed. They like the money that it generates. So
with this genre, what aspect of it do you feel like you're responsible for in terms of moving it forward?
I feel a huge responsibility in terms of pushing the genre forward, not just in terms of telling more interesting stories, because obviously you want to do that so people will read your stuff, because if you're telling boring stories, they're not going to read it. But for me, it's a big responsibility in terms of diversity. Historically, it has not been a genre that has been very good at being diverse. There's been lots of stories that are set in, you know, New York about white men. And I think it's so important to tell stories that are reflective of the world that we see. So that's one of the big things that I'm trying to do in my writing, is including characters who are, you know, LGBTQ, characters who are neurodiverse, characters who are men and women, people of color, just making sure that the worlds that we're telling, when we're using our imaginations and we're creating these fantastical worlds, and we're forgetting to even make them as incredible as the world we actually live in. And that's just so important.
I definitely want to include diverse, you know, skin color and sexuality and all of those things. And I have been doing that. But one of the things that I think is super important in this genre is also demonstrating healthy relationships. In particular in vampire fiction. I'm doing a vampire romance series because I think that it is possible to have a functioning relationship where the male is not abusive and it's not an obsessed relationship. I think it's important to demonstrate, especially for younger audiences, that you can have a vampire boyfriend who isn't a psycho.
I definitely think it's important to have some elements that are definitely original. There's probably going to be some things that are a little bit repetitive because they all fall in the same genre. But I do strive to have some original aspects to every story. And ultimately, at the end of the day, too, I think your characters are what sets a story apart and makes it unique. But I think it's also important to kind of push the boundaries of what exists and create something entirely new.
I think, like in this third Timeless book, Timeless Trinity, it's the most spiritual of the three paranormal books. It has 28 different stories, 34 in the first book, 31 in the second, 28 in this third book. And I come up with this idea, this theory that might be useful for fiction writers too, that what I believe to be true based on all my experiences is that the spirit world that is inhabited by spirits and ghosts and all that stuff, and the alien world and the quantum world of science, quantum mechanics, is all the same thing. And we're really talking about the same thing. So if that is true, I think that opens up a lot of possibilities for all different types of works.